When Jack asked me to speak, he asked me to speak of the Koffolt, or the Withrow-Koffolt years. I think I'm going to call them, though, the Doc and Joe years, because I think that's probably it more captures the feeling of the situation. Doc and Joe, it was a marriage made in heaven. It really was, because Doc brought Dad along as he was his mentor. He encouraged him. He gave him great freedom, always very formal, but he gave him great freedom, and that worked fairly well until towards the end, when Doc really didn't want to retire, and the dean finally insisted that if Dad didn't agree to accept the position of chairman, that they were going to have to retire Doc anyway, and they go get somebody else. So he finally agreed to work with them and have Dr. Withrow retire. But all through this time, I think Dad, he had great respect for Dr. Withrow's ability as an educator and as a professional chemical engineer. It was something that he felt very strongly about. He would get very angry and very upset. I mean, I can remember his nights he would come home, and even as a little guy, you could feel the tension that was there. Dad really had no intention of coming back or staying at Ohio State. Doc really seduced him into coming back for his master's degree in 28, and then he started his PhD after that and obtained that in 31, and Doc prevailed upon him to stay as an instructor. And so, as I say, Doc mentored him and he brought him along. Dad, of course, loved the inorganic chemistry side of the profession. He did his PhD thesis up at the Ritterton Salt Works. I'm probably pronouncing the name wrong, up in Mentor, Ohio, and I read through correspondence of the exchanges between he and Dr. Withrow, almost daily or weekly communications. I guess the email of the day was the letterbox. Dad married in 1930. I came along in 32, so this was right at the start of his career. As people have noted, Dr. Withrow was probably the most somber man I think I have ever met. Though, if there was something that pleased him, he would get this smile on his face. It was sort of a sly smile, and his eyes would twinkle, and you'd see a momentary flash of a personality that really was warm. And I think, as probably Ed expressed it, he had a very soft spot for his students. He would not let anybody get close to that until they really got into trouble. But he really had a soft spot for him. Doc was also, as people have pointed out, very religious. Inspection trips were not what they were later on. Doc would not travel on a Sunday. He wouldn't do anything on a Sunday. So if they had to be someplace on Monday, he would book the 1 a.m. train or the 2 a.m. train, and Dad would have to swing by it with a cab at least 1 minute after 12 on Monday morning and pick him up, and they would head off. He was always very formal in dress. When Dad passed away, I sort of cleaned out all his files at the university and at home, and I really didn't have a good chance to go through them until this past summer. The class of 53 had asked me to say something at their 50th reunion, so I spent about 2 weeks going through that correspondence. I never found one note between them where Doc hadn't addressed him as Dr. Joseph H. Koffolt. There was no personal Joe or Dr. Withrow. It was always very, very, very formal. Mrs. Withrow she was just a very, very gracious person. I remember several dinners at their home, and she wasn't necessarily the life of the party, but she was very open and would speak freely and sort of humored Doc along, I think. Doc was very strict with the students. Severe, I guess, is the term. And I'm going to read something that may help explain it. I found this in the bottom of a letter. There had been the class of 33 was, they called them the Bellyachers, and they had apparently written a manifesto to Doc asking to be treated more like human beings rather than serfs, and that got all sorts of things stirred up. And this then generated out to the alums, and a group was formed that actually went and saw the president and complained about the department. They wanted the department investigated, the severity of Dr. Withrow. Some of the guys weren't able to travel. So this went on from 34 through, I guess the last report I read was in 38. Always Doc asking Dad to recount what happened during this period because something new came up. In one of these letters, the dean had said, isn't it true that Dr. Withrow is very severe with his students at times? Dad wrote back to the dean, or he reported the following in his answer to the dean. Yes, it is true, Dr. Withrow is rather severe at times, but his severeness is not with an individual, but with the method of thinking of the individual. By getting to the bottom of it by this method, severity, a student may be taught things he will always remember when he is out. Dr. Withrow always warns the students at his first lecture of this severity that's going to come. Then the staff cools them down, as someone mentioned. Dad and Al Vilbrandt and Dan Duncan would all calm them down so they didn't quite feel the Great Depression that might overcome them as they heard these words from Doc. This whole investigation thing did have a very, very unfortunate, not end to it, but a situation arose. Al Vilbrandt, who was one of the teachers that Ed mentioned, he had 7 kids. He was earning $2,100 a year, and he just didn't have the money to go to these conferences that you know, to publish and to make yourself known. And one of these accusations was that Al wasn't doing his job, and they had sort of an inquisition, and he was brought to task for that and put on notice that something had to happen. Al died a week later of a heart attack that was probably due to the stress of this situation, and Doc regretted that ever so much, that everything had happened to cause this to happen to Al. It was the height of the budget. Everybody was in budget problems. No one was getting paid like they thought they should. So it was a tough time. As the time progressed, I'm going to jump a little bit to the other death that occurred in the building. Charlie Owens, who I believe Ed measured, had the office next to Dad on the 2nd floor. On the day of the Battle of Midway, his stepson came up and shot him dead in the office. And Charlie died in Dad's arms, and it had a tremendous impact on him about he was a very, very kind person, and to see a human life taken like that made a lasting impression on him. Back to happier times. Mary Robb was to Dr. Withrow as Ms. Blue was to Amos and Andy, if that makes any sense to any of you here. It was an old radio show, and Buzz Me, Miss Blue, and it seemed like Doc was always calling on Miss Robb to do something for him. Dad grew over the 30s in reputation and experience. His philosophy really came to the fore. He believed in personal contact with everyone in the department and felt he had the obligation to the children of the state to know everyone he taught and not to forget them. I believe he held true to that philosophy until he passed away. The fact that he could come and as one of the alums' wives said today, he would put the wife's name on the Christmas cards. At the end, he was writing somewhere in the neighborhood of 650 to 700 Christmas cards a year, each one with a note, and each one picking out something that the guy or he had heard about, or how the kids were doing, and he just had a tremendous memory and ability to connect. The state office building explosion in 1932. Understand, I'm picking a lot of this out. in 1932, I was born a week after the thing blew up, so I don't really know this at firsthand, but I know of Dad's comments, and then reading the files later has allowed me to put some insight to the situation. He and Dr. Withrow worked hard to determine if it was a natural gas or man-made gas that blew up the place. It was lots and lots of work, and a very heavy price was paid in time. Doc at that time also delegated more and more responsibilities to Dad, and this put a great deal of pressure on my mom because besides his office at the university, he had an office upstairs in the house, and my memories, as far as they go back, are of him working. And so I think he was probably the classic example of a workaholic who loved people and could never say no. Dad published with his graduate students, but Doc had insisted that his name be on everything that went out, whether he had anything to do with it or not. And this was fine for the first 10, 12, 13 years, but towards the end of the mid-40s, it really became an issue. And I remember a night in 1946 when I heard Dad slam something down in his office at home, and he said, "Never again." And I don't think he really published seriously after that point. And it was the frustration of Doc taking credit for something that maybe he didn't deserve. During the 30s, Dad became deeply committed to AICHE and SPEE, the Society for Professional Engineering Educators. He went to all the meetings that he could. I was in 40 of the 48 states by the time of 1940, and 44 out of 48 by 1946. So it was a tremendous opportunity for us to see the world as he went to the various meetings. It also got me to Wisconsin, and I sort of fell in love with the place, and after having babysat for the dean's grandchildren when they were in town and knowing so many people and taking data at the unit ops lab for some of the graduate students back in the early 40s, I decided that it would be best if I went elsewhere. So that's why I ended up at Wisconsin. As it was mentioned, between Dr. Withrow and Dad, OSU was one of the first 10 universities accredited by the AICHE, and they took very, very, very great pride in that fact. Dad received several offers in the late 30s as his reputation grew. One very serious from the University of Alabama, where they had invited him to become the chair. I found correspondence going back between he and Dean McQuigg and Doc Withrow about evaluating the situation. They finally prevailed that he should stay, saying that Doc was going to retire soon and he would be given the chairmanship, and so why didn't he stick around? That was fine, but sticking around involved 8 more years, and those 8 years were tough because Doc moved further and further back from the day-to-day, and so Dad was essentially running the place, but the ultimate authority rested in Doc's hands, and there were always conflicts. The war years were they were very sad years, but as far as the students went, he loved those war classes. I mean, he would speak about them and the enthusiasm the guys had, even though they had to work such horrendous schedules. Ace Day in those days involved floats going around the campus, and he had built me a little Jeep, and somehow they managed to get the Jeep on the float, and I was able to ride around the campus on the float, and that was a very pleasant memory for a 10-year-old at that point in time. Also, the state fair, the university would put on exhibits at the state fair, something working, like making rayon, and I was allowed to help set up that and maybe be in the booth for most of the time. So those were very happy times for me. The return of the veterans was another era. He found them very, very serious. He made some very, very strong, good and lasting friendships during those times. He felt he had some very good classes, such as the class of '52 that he called the class of champions. He also had one that will remain nameless that he called his class of dummies. I guess like the bad boy class. And it was the guys who were, there were no more veterans, and the Korean War had just started, so the young men going into school were facing the possibility of the Korean War, and it really distracted them. But he was understanding and helped them all get through it. His jewels really flourished. I mean, I think at one point he had over 220 people with Union Carbide. I'm sure he's spinning in his grave as he heard about the Dow Carbide get-together, because he, with his first job being with Carbide, he probably felt, as I did, that they would be there forever. As you all know, he would not let the university handle the placement of his students. He felt that he knew them well enough by observing them, and he knew the companies well enough that he would match the personalities of the man to the company. Unit Ops Lab was a very significant time for him because he would go out and watch how the guys responded. He could pick out the practical ones from the theoretical ones. The water pressure used to drop in Columbus at about 5 o'clock as everybody came home, and he'd wander out and see who made the first move to change the valves on the water flow to the condensers, and that would be a good mark, or it could be a bad mark, but he factored that in as he evaluated the strengths of his boys. I think he had the ability to pick out the strengths as opposed to harp on the weaknesses, and I think it benefited his students. When he assumed the chairmanship in '48, as Alex said, he felt his first priority was to build the staff up, and he put an awful lot of effort in going out after such folks as Alex and Webb Kay and Al Syverson, Christie, Charlie Lapple, Emmy Lynn, Bob Brotke in the mid-50s, and Ed Herring came back from the Navy at that point in time, and he really, I think, built a staff that was compatible, had maybe a little bit different, well, it did have a different bent to it. It was more on the research side as opposed to what it probably had been in the 30s, where it was practical applications of Doc's hated word, unit operations. Certainly not to the extent of what I've heard in the past day about what Dr. Fan and Jack have built the department to be, where it just amazes me when I see what's going on now. The second priority was to get out of the McPherson labs and into quarters, be fitting one of the top chem engineering schools in the country. He personally took over the whole job, from the planning to the looking over the architect's shoulders and the construction. Many hours and much stress. And in 1959, he suffered his first mini stroke, and I think that was really the beginning of the downhill slide. He just was worn out, I think, is probably the fact. And these then continued through the 60s. I know many of you in those classes put up with a great deal, as I understand he'd start a lecture and then he might repeat it halfway through, but they always seemed to know that he had their best interests at heart, and when it came to getting a job, he was going to be sure that he got the right guy in the right company, and so you all live with it, and I'm sure he was very thankful about that. During this time also, he found his true love, which was the Kerr-McGee potash operations in Death Valley, Trona, California. He thought that was the next thing to heaven, and I think he spent, 4 summers there. Parker Dunn, one of his old bosses back when he was doing his PhD, asked him to come out and look at their quadruple effect evaporation system and see if he could make significant improvements to their efficiency, and he really dug into it, and I think did them some good. He wanted to retire. That's the vision he had about, he loved the desert, had always loved the desert. he took Mom out with him on one of those visits, and that didn't work out very well. And so I think it really broke his heart when she said, "No way, Jose." So during the 50s, I think he was recognized for his unique care and nurturing of his students. There were several local awards here in the Columbus and Ohio area that he received. He was elected a director of AICHE. I mean, next to his students and the university, AICHE was his next true love that he really put his whole heart and soul into. And he really worked across the nation promoting the student memberships and participation of the students. You just didn't sign up. You also went and participated. He was awarded the Walker K. Lewis Award by AICHE, which gave him a great deal of pleasure. Sadly, the university in 1972 awarded him an honorary Doctor of Science degree, but he had that stroke several months before, and he just couldn't appear for it. So I sort of walked across the field and accepted it for him, and then Doc Syverson and Webb and my mom went down to the nursing home and put the cape on him and everything. And I think he knew what was going on, but it was sort of a sad moment. Then in 77, when the university deemed fit to rename the department the Koffolt Laboratory, he was, of course, not able to participate in that. I don't know whether I got through to him or not. Maybe I mentioned before that the only way I could communicate with Dad after the stroke was to make some outlandish statement about chemical engineering. I'd tell him the phase rule. I thought it was a bunch of stuff, and he would get activated by that, and we would have some interchange. So I hope that he knew what was going to happen. He died 10 days before the building was dedicated in his name, so that also was sort of a sad effect. In summary, I believe that the Department of Chemical Engineering at Ohio State was both Dr. Withrow's and my dad's life. They certainly approached it from different directions, but without both of them, I think there would have been a couple of thousand students out there from Ohio State who would not have had the preparation that they had. Thank you very much. On the table there are some of Dad's lecture notes, just out of curiosity, one of the original chem engineering handbooks, and a list of programs from AICHE starting in 1910. There's also a pile of his papers, just in case anybody's interested. I'm leaving all of this with Geoff. We also found a set of notes, of staff meeting notes, dating 1908 to 1913, and Geoff has that under lock and key because it will eventually end up in the department's archive. So appreciate the chance to speak with you, and we'll all think kindly of him. Thank you.